Okay, so that was one chorus, very slow, of Pony Blues by Charley Patton. Good afternoon. Today is Friday, the 24th of October, and this is Midnight at the Crossroads, which is my sort of irregular show where I dive into specific topics about the blues. Today we are going to talk about Delta blues as a genre, where it fits into the broader blues landscape, how to recognize it, how to play it, what kinds of things you have to take into consideration if you're going to play it. First of all, this piece is by Charley Patton. Charley Patton is considered, in many cases, the father of the Delta blues. Certainly one of the earliest successful Delta blues artists, at least one that we have records of. He was born in 1891 in southern Mississippi. He was of mixed race, black, white, and some Native American blood. And at the age of 6, his family moved to the Dockery Plantation. And the Dockery Plantation is going to come up pretty consistently as we're talking about the history of the blues, because that was kind of the epicenter of Delta blues as we know it, because that is where Charley Patton met a man named Henry Spear, who taught him to play the guitar. Now, he was kind of the original shredder, like when you see like Eddie Van Halen, playing guitar with his teeth, playing guitar behind his back, straddling the guitar, playing between his legs. That's all the kind of thing that Charley Patton was legendary for doing on stage. So this is kind of a good place to start with Delta blues. This is one of the names that is going to come up when we talk about Delta blues. Let's see what else we got. I'm drawing on a few different sources here to make sure I get years and dates and names right. This is Play the Blues Like by Pete Madsen, which is a pretty cool book that it deals a lot with alternate tunings and specific subgenres of the blues. There's a whole chapter on Charley Patton, and the way it works is it'll give you a couple characteristic Charley Patton licks, and then it'll build you up to a whole song. Now, Charley Patton played in both standard tuning, which I just played Pony Blues in. He also played a lot in open G, which is kind of a characteristic of the Delta blues. So let's talk about Delta blues as a style. Delta blues, the names that come up, you're going to hear Charley Patton. Here's a little picture of Charley Patton. You can see that he is rather, he is obviously ethnically ambiguous. He was one of the first, multi-hit blues players out there. What's special about the Delta blues is the use of slide, the use of solo guitar. W.C. Handy was in Mississippi in the 1890s when he heard the first thing he called blues. And he has often been called the father of the blues or the father of jazz. But what W.C. Handy heard was a guy at a train station playing his guitar with the back of the blade of a pocket knife, moving that up and down like we would use a slide. And that's what W.C. Handy first recognized as the blues. And it kind of went out from there. Now, from the Delta, we're talking Charley Patton, we're talking Blind Willie McTell, we're talking Robert Johnson, who's legendary. I think we're going to do an episode at some point just about Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson is one of the great guitar players of all time. He is an iconic Delta blues player, both fingerstyle and slide, both standard and open G tuning, much like Charley Patton. Now, Blind Willie McTell was, we don't really have a lot of his recordings, and the recordings we do have are in kind of strange tunings, but we do know that he primarily played a 12-string guitar, which is interesting because you don't think of that as a blues instrument, but there are several blues players who are 12-string guys. There's Barbecue Bob, I think his name is. There's Big Joe Williams was a 12-string player, and a lot of times these guys would have these huge ladder-braced 12 strings that were much bigger than a 12-string you'd get today, because they hadn't yet invented some of the more structurally sound bracing methods. So you'd have to have this big guitar with a lot of lateral slats to support the extra tension from the extra 6 strings. So what these guys would do is they would take these big guitars, they would tune them down to either open tunings or just flattened standard tunings, and they would have this big boomy, bassy sound. It's pretty cool. I do have to acquire a 12 string at one point, just to explore that and see, you know, if I even can play it with my fingers. But that's kind of part of the tradition. It's not something you see a lot in the modern fingerstyle blues community. So let's talk about the Delta. What Delta are we talking about? We're talking about the Mississippi River Delta, which isn't necessarily confined to the state of Mississippi. You can see the Mississippi Delta goes up, it's a broad floodplain south of Memphis, covers the northwestern part of the state of Mississippi, contiguous eastern Arkansas. From the river, this is the Delta, broad flat from the river east to the Tallahatchie Ridge and south to the bluffs of Vicksburg. This was, like most deltas, this was agricultural land. This was a place where the soil was regularly refreshed by both the moisture of the water and everything that died in the river and all the nutrients that were carried by the river. You had this stagnant water that created this super fertile soil. And like every other civilization that was growing and had people to feed, this is where agriculture happened. And this is where a lot of other things happened. This is where, even after the emancipation from slavery, you still had a lot of Black Americans working on plantations, in most cases as sharecroppers in a state that was probably akin to slavery in terms of standard of living, where, you know, most of what you produced would just go away or go to your landlord instead of your master. And there were these itinerant workers who were called mule skinners. There's an old tune, Mule Skinners Blues. These are not actually guys who kill and skin mules. These are guys who were very skilled teamsters. They were mule drivers who would have a team of mules and would have incredible control over them, so they could be used for plowing, so they could be used for extra, you know, they were the equivalent of, you know, what you would now use bulldozers and backhoes for. That was where you got the power to dig things, to open things, to haul things. You had these technical experts in mule handling who were usually African American men who learned these skills under slavery and were now very much in demand. So these became like family legacies that were passed on. These guys would have these teams of mules and they'd be very good with them. This is kind of where most scholars think the blues came from, the Mississippi Delta. That's certainly where W.C. Handy discovered it. That is where all the iconic guys that we call the fathers of the blues played. And this is where, you know, Blind Lemon, Jefferson, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Elmore James, all these guys who later popularized electric urban blues, this is where they got their sound. This is what they drew on. And Elmore James also draws on Mississippi Hill Country blues. That'll be a separate episode at some point. But back to the Delta. This was kind of the style of all these sub-styles of blues. We'll talk about Delta blues, and we also talk about, you know, Mississippi Hill Country blues, Texas blues, Piedmont blues. We talk about like Elizabeth Cotton's like folk finger picking that was bluesy in origin but wasn't necessarily still blues. All of this, including all the electric blues, came out of the Delta originally, we think. What else? So Delta blues, what else do I have to cover? Okay, so this is Stefan Grossman's complete country blues guitar book. This is his chapter on Delta blues. He cites Sam Charters, who is describing the impact of the Delta. From the Delta came some of the greatest of the country singers. The Delta blues had left a deep mark on both American and European popular culture. In the South, the Delta is a term loosely applied to the cotton area of northwest Mississippi, and it includes towns and counties that are not within the drainage system of the Yazoo River, but there is a distinctiveness to the singing styles, even between someone like Frank Stokes from the northern edge of the Delta and J.D. Short, who grew up in the country to the south of it, and spent his youth in Clarksdale and moved away from Mississippi to St. Louis. The Delta blues style is one of the most intense expressions of the country blues. The voice is heavy and dark, the tone forced through the clenched throat, as though the singer were forcing himself to speak. A phrase becomes a choked growl. A deeply felt verse becomes a lightened falsetto. The guitar strings are pulled until they sting the fretboard with their vibration. A bottleneck is broken off and slipped on the little finger to slide along the top string in a disturbing singing note. The rhythms are the insistent, rushing beat of J.D. Short as he flails at the strings, or the intricately patterned phrases of Son House as he sets his voice against the guitar in an interplay too deep for words. This is the blues at its most musical, an emotional limit of expression. A few singers from other areas, like Lemon Jefferson and Willie McTell, have left as deep a personal imprint on the blues, but no other group of singers has given so much to this rich strain of American music. So, stylistically, we heard a little bit about the kinds of singing voices that are used when we're talking about the Delta blues. We also heard about the bottleneck, the slide. Now, originally you would just break a bottle, literally break a bottle, and you would have the bottleneck as a slide. So any kind of glass slide you see today, whether it's a fancy one like this or a simple one like this, is an ancestor of that broken bottleneck. The metal slides that came later, also an ancestor of the bottleneck, but an ancestor of that jackknife that W.C. Handy saw a man using. So slide usually comes into play in alternate tuning. Right now we are in standard tuning. The two tunings that are going to be most common in Delta blues are open G, which goes D on the lowest string, G, D as normal on the fourth string, G as normal on the third string, a B still on the B string, and the high E string is dropped to a high D. So you have an open G chord on your strings that is often used, not exclusively with slide, but slide is almost always open G if it's Delta blues. Now let's talk about standard tuning and what we see in the Delta blues. Well, one of the things that was mentioned is those strings being pulled till they snap against the fretboard. And this is something you do see in Delta blues, this kind of, and sometimes that'll be done with muting. So it's even more percussive and even less melodic. And that's kind of a characteristic Delta blues technique. Another characteristic Delta blues technique is the rake. That's where you've got steady thumb bass going, and we saw it a little bit in Pony Blues. These fingers kind of pick the bottom two strings, one string, sometimes all the strings, but it is an upward motion. It is casual, it is not precise. It often brushes more strings than just the target. There's a sloppiness to it that is very indicative of the Delta blues. Now, in terms of like voicings that we see in the Delta blues, often we're dealing with a steady thumb bass and chords that are going to be on the higher frets of the higher strings. So rather than using, let's say, this kind of E7 voicing down here, we're much more likely to see voicings up here, and we're likely to see a lot of things happening between the 10th and 12th fret, especially when there's a slide involved. Pretty much all the melody for the E passages of Pony Blues is going to happen up here, right? So we're from the 7th to the 9th fret. So you see all these notes up here. So it really plays with that contrast between a muted deep bass and a very high ringy register of the voicings we're using. Now you'll use both chord strums and single notes there. In terms of scales, we spend a lot of time in the minor pentatonic. That's pretty characteristic of blues in general. So Delta blues, we are talking about music that is open G or standard tuning. We're talking about a lot of higher, both on the higher strings and in the higher frets, chord voicings. So this gets you out of that first 5 frets comfort zone a lot, especially in the E passages. You will find yourself up here a lot in Delta blues. You will see a lot of phrases that kind of come in on the one end or on the end at another point in things. So rather than having what you might consider a characteristic that kind of phrasing where oftentimes the melody note is happening on the 1, you'll see things like this where it's 1 and 2, where you'll usually come in partway through the measure with the melody notes, and you'll see a lot of phrasing in both Texas blues and Delta blues, which again, they're both kind of monotonic. We'll talk about that a little more when we get to Texas blues, but you'll see these kind of phrases that often have a bass and then things happening 1 and 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Things will start on the and then they'll happen. So the melody almost has a phrasing that's cockeyed a little bit from the phrasing of the bass, if that makes sense. So we're usually starting on an upbeat. We're usually starting on something other than the first section or the first bass note. You'll often see pickup phrases that that precede the beginning of the bass. The melody kind of gets a hint there, and then the bass kicks in, and then the bass and the melody are interspersed, and they don't necessarily fit together as regularly as they would in, say, a Mississippi John Hurt tune. So that is a 35,000 foot view of the Delta blues, which I'm going to be exploring more. Look forward to a better performance of Pony Blues coming up. I would like to get that one up to speed. I'm working a lot on that. We're going to play a little more with the slide, and we're going to try to get an open G tune in the Delta tradition going too, so I can add that to my repertoire. Thank you for watching. This is Bill Callahan at Fretboard Refugee, and this has been an episode of Beginner at the Crossroads. Thank you.